Blog Talk Radio.
Vir guns en vir moord en vir rape. Ek smoeg vir die bad news, vir Zuma en sy views, van ons op TV moet kyk. Ek wil nie meer hoor hoe ons tieners begrawe, oor niemand hul steur aan die wet. Ek wil nie meer lees van affirmative action of beklei om te hou wat ek het. Gee vir my 'n nuwe geit, 'n koorstoeplesie en 'n tellery, wat lief sing en stry, oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Ek stiek vir Malema, sy leuns en sy sê maar, ons hou maar ons mond en betaal. Ons kruip weg in kampe, word blind vir die rampe, en bid dat die Heer ons omhaal. Daar's Winnie Mandela, wat mense verbrand het, maar nou wil sy huil in haar hand. Die staatskas is leeg en die ANC jeug saai verwoesting en pyn deur ons land. Gee vir my 'n nuwe geit, 'n koorstoeplesie en 'n tellery, wat lief sing en stry, oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Het betaal vir die grond, waar sy kinders se kinders kan bly. Maar sy huis en sy lande is nou in die hande van die vyand teen wie hy moes stry. Ons kinders verstaan nie, waar kom al vandaan nie, hul erfenis is uitgewis. Geen volkslied of vlag nie, en geen erewag nie, vir die helde wat daar nie meer is. Gee vir my 'n nuwe geit, 'n koorstoeplesie en 'n tellery, wat lief sing en stry, oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Gee vir my 'n nuwe geit, 'n koorstoeplesie en 'n tellery, wat lief sing en stry, oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. En ons reg om hier te kan bly.
Brought to you courtesy of Rage Against the Regime podcast. This is your host, Karen Smith. I would like to give a huge thank you to Becky Williams and Bobby Ritter for giving South Africans another platform to shine some truth on the actual state of events in the Rainbow Nation. Our intro song is by Sunette Bridges, a South African activist whose music is banned in South Africa, but this song reached #1 in Belgium. Translated, it means enough. Enough of the murder, rape, torture, discrimination, hijacking, etc., that are the daily lot of the white South African. I thought it only sensible to start a new show with new listeners by getting an expert on the true history of South Africa to counter the misinformation that has been disseminated about the white tribe of South Africa. Cuan Elgin has written an incredibly well-researched history of South Africa, Bulala, The True Story of South Africa, which is available from Amazon and is recommended reading for everyone with an interest in the sad decline of a once prosperous, proud nation. Welcome, Cuan.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello,
Cuan.
Karen.
Thank you very, very much for doing this debut show with me. You're the very best person that I could ever think of to give our new listeners an overview about the truth in South Africa.
Well, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be on your show. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cuan, people believe the garbage disseminated in public about the whites stealing the land in South Africa from the blacks, etc. So basically, I would like to turn the next 2 hours over to you, and you can explain firstly who you are, and then start at the beginning of your book at the fact that there was nobody in the Cape when the first settlers landed, and they weren't really settlers when the Dutch first landed there.
Thank you, Karen. Well, there were people. They were not. They called themselves Khoi Khoi, which means men of men, and there was a small group similar who called themselves Khoi San, which basically means men who have nothing. They were subsequently called Bushmen, which they call themselves today, and the Khoi Khoi today have readopted that name. For many years they were called Cape Coloureds. They are the original settlers in southern Africa. They came by foot. The later settlers were the whites who came by sea. Everybody in southern Africa is a settler in one way or another. But the Khoi Khoi and the Khoi San were very different from the black tribes that we know today. And they had a very unusual language, a clicking language made up of almost sounds that they heard in nature, animal sounds, bird sounds, etc. They had no written language. They didn't have the wheel. They had some poetry, interestingly enough. They lived in portable animal hide tents. They did have some cattle. They had dogs. They had fat-tailed sheep. That's the Khoi Khoi. The Khoi San, the Bushmen, were hunting. In fact, they preyed on the livestock of the Khoi Khoi. They considered them just more easily hunted, and they lived in caves or just in the open. They very much a tiny little group today. They're virtually extinct. There can't be more than a few thousand left, and they're deep in the Kalahari, most of them, Kalahari Desert. Not by choice. Nobody would live in the Kalahari Desert by choice.
No, wow, I've driven through there. I lived in Southwest Africa for a number of years, and no, nobody would live there by choice.
No, they were driven there, Karen. They were driven there by the black tribes mainly. They were preyed upon by the tribes who moved into South Africa or Southern Africa at a much later stage, after the whites, in fact. The first explorers were, in fact, the Portuguese, the first European explorers in the late 1400s, around about the same time that they were exploring the Americas. The one who springs to mind here is Bartholomew Dias, and he was the first to round the Cape of Africa, which was called by the Portuguese the Cape of Storms, for good reason. And the later settlers were the Dutch, who originally didn't intend to settle. They intended to set up a refreshment station for their ships, which were plying the sea routes to the east. And they renamed it, for marketing purposes, the Cape of Good Hope. And that's how it is still known today. And it is a magnificent area, as you probably well know, absolutely scenically outstanding. I've been to, I think it's 32 countries now. Many people have been to many more. But virtually anyone who comes to South Africa and to the Cape specifically will tell you the same thing, that there is no more beautiful place on earth. We say that proudly, and everybody thinks their own country is beautiful, and most countries have their own natural beauty. But the Cape is spectacular. Our mountains soar into the sky, our seas are wild, our beaches are magnificent, our developments have been in tune with that landscape. We have magnificent vineyards and orchards and farming land. The is savanna, and the black tribes moved as far south as the grazing allowed. They were cattle herders. These are what we call the Bantu tribes. It's more of a language group, the Nguni language. And they moved down from west, east, and central Africa around about the same time that the first white settlers were moving up into the interior, and they eventually clashed. But for anyone to say that any particular group owns all the land in the country or has a right to it is nonsense. Every group here has a claim to the land, and an equal claim, and the white settlers in the Cape developed the land. None of the others did. They were subsistence farmers, if anything. They grazed their cattle, they grew a few subsistence crops, but there was no infrastructure developed. They had no written language, as I mentioned. They didn't have the wheel. They were fairly primitive, and the whites started building towns and infrastructure, and the black folk moved into those towns or close to them to share in the benefits of civilization.
Absolutely, Cuan, absolutely. But as you said, and as I said, the original Jan van Riebeeck did not intend to colonize South Africa at all. They just wanted to form that refreshment station. So when did that change?
Well, that's quite right. The Dutch, at the same time that they were establishing what they called Kaapstad, now known as Cape Town, New York was being established, but it was called New Amsterdam, of course. The Dutch settled there, and eventually it became New York when the British took over, and the same way when the British took over here, Kaapstad became Cape Town. Jan van Riebeeck was the first governor of the Cape, 1652, so New York and Cape Town were established within a year of each other. And there's many, many parallels, which I'm sure your American listeners might be interested in, which I'll go into in some detail. Many parallels between South Africa and the United States. And the Dutch established gardens and orchards and vegetables, on their way to the east. And the Dutch East India Company, the big corporate of the day, didn't encourage settlers. They wanted everyone to work for them. So if you farmed for them, and you sold your goods to them at prices set by them. So there was very little free enterprise allowed until people who'd been brought out by the Dutch East India Company. This included not just Dutch. There were Scandinavians, Germans, all sorts from Europe who came out in various capacities, either as military or as administrators, craftsmen, etc. There were some slaves at that early stage which were brought to South Africa by the Dutch, mostly from the east, Java, Indonesia, etc., some from India. There were a few Negro or Negroid slaves who were brought from East Africa by the Portuguese. And I might point out that no South African has ever been enslaved. I believe your famous talk show host Oprah Winfrey at one stage had a notion that she was a Zulu princess descended from a Zulu prince who was dragged in chains to America. Well, that's impossible because no South African has ever been enslaved. Slaves were brought here in those early days as they were brought to America. And I believe that Oprah had a DNA test and it turned out she had West African heritage, which is what we would expect. So these early settlers were in fact employees of the company, the Dutch East India Company. But once their tenure had been completed, their contract with the company, slowly but surely they started doing their own thing and farming on the outskirts of the company's grounds. And they were allowed to do so on land bought by the company from the Khoi, who were in the area. And I must point out the differences between the Khoi and the And the Bantu tribes, they're physically different as well. They're much smaller people. They're much paler people. They're almost an apricot colored. They have almost oriental eyes. They don't identify with the black or Bantu tribes. The modern day descendants of the Khoi speak Afrikaans, like many of the white folk do here, which contains a few of their own original words and a few mixtures of others, but mostly Dutch or Flemish. And they identify very much more closely with the Afrikaner than they do with the black folk. So they're still a distinct group. They are mostly Christians, some are Muslim. About 80% of South Africa considers themselves Christians. The Bantu tribes to be ancestor worshipping, some Christians, but their original religion was ancestor worship, and very much so to this day. They still go to witch doctors and indulge in black magic practices, etc. So we have a very much of a melting pot in South Africa. The Bantu tribes, as I mentioned, migrated as far as the grazing would allow. Where the climate changed, which is the Eastern Cape, we call it, which is somewhat up the east coast, about 1,000 miles, you could say, from Cape Town, the grazing changes from grassland to more of a Mediterranean type of a climate, scrubland. And it's not all that suitable for cattle, so they stopped there. It was a natural migration, and that was a natural barrier, and that's where they stopped. And they stayed there. They never came further south. By that time, the Cape Town was pretty well established. In fact, it enjoyed all the benefits of civilization. There was great art, great theatre, great architecture. The Dutch, as you know, are wonderful agricultural engineers. They built canals. They farmed extensively, and all this was going on in Cape Town without the black folk north even knowing about it, and without the white folk in the south knowing about the black tribes. They'd never seen a black, other than the odd slave that had been brought there, as I mentioned. It was only once the ships started exploring further up the coast that they started coming into contact with these black tribes, and they recorded the fact. And it was only after about 130 years of settlement in the Cape that the farmers who had now broken away from the company began to look for more space, grazing for their cattle, and they started trekking, as we call it. That's where the word comes from, inland. They were known as trek boers, which means traveling farmers or wandering farmers. They started moving inland with the Bantu tribes, and that's 1,000 miles north of Cape Town. So the Cape area, as we call it, it's a massive area, probably the size of Texas. That has never been in any way owned or even used by the black tribes. Today they are moving in substantial numbers, and that is an ended thing by the current regime. They want to tip the vote, shall we say, in their favor in the various towns there. But either way, the trekkers in about the 1830s started to trek inland in substantial numbers. And by then, the British had taken over the Cape, and they decided they needed to create a buffer zone between the black tribes in the Eastern Cape and the white settlements in the Cape itself. So they brought in what we call the 1820 settlers, and in quite large numbers, mostly British of various types, Irish, Welsh, Scots, and English. And they were given small farms, roughly 100 acres, and to an Englishman, 100 acres was a gentleman's estate. They didn't realize, of course, until they got there, that farming on the harsh South African veldt was a far cry from tilling the green fields of home. So they struggled at first, but eventually settled down to some substantial farming and established themselves very well. And they are now, the descendants of those 1820 settlers are the English-speaking folk of South Africa, which is about 40% of the whites. 60% roughly are Afrikaans-speaking, which is the way it's been for the last 180 years. Language of its own, from Dutch and Flemish mostly.
That's very interesting, those numbers, because considering how many people have left South Africa just immediately prior to and after 1994, it is amazing that the balance has been kept.
Indeed, Karen. I would say, generally speaking, more English-speaking South Africans, white South Africans, have left than Afrikaans-speaking. They still had connections, perhaps, with with home, as they used to call it in England, the UK, and tended to be more cosmopolitan. The language was a barrier to them, and we have I'll give you the polite version of it. The English-speaking South Africans are called by the Afrikaans-speaking South Africans soties, which is salties. Which means they have 1 foot in England, 1 foot in South Africa, and an appendage dangling in the ocean. So, but it's a kind of a fun name for them. I'm an English-speaking South African, as you can probably tell, but I'm reasonably fluent in Afrikaans, as most South Africans are. We also normally speak a smattering of the blacker languages. I've picked up a little bit of Zulu, having been born in Natal, which is right next to Zululand. So we managed to communicate, but English is now the lingua franca of South Africa. It's the most used language, you could say, although Zulu in actual numbers is probably the most populous language. But we all get along. We always have, and despite what the media presents and has for the last 50 years, that there's this eternal strife, there isn't. We get along pretty well as a country. People of all races get along pretty well. It's the politicians who are constantly creating friction and animosity, and they do it for their own reasons, to build their own power bases, to shift blame for incompetence onto another group. The South African population is now about 55 million officially. Others say it's closer to 70 million because we have a lot of illegal immigrants. Our borders have become pretty porous in the last 20 years. But the white South Africans, that's English and Afrikaans speaking, now constitute only about 8 or 8.5% of the population. So we are well less than 10%. We're around about 4 million or so. The South African population never got quite to 5 million of the whites. About 4.8 was maximum, and almost 1 million have left. So we were around about 4 million. And the ones who've left, unfortunately, were very much in those who had abused elsewhere in the world, those who had the money to leave, those who had the initiative to leave. So we've lost a lot of good people, but we still have many good people here, and a lot have come back because they've realized sometimes the grass is not greener on the other side. And I can tell you, I spent 4 months in the UK last year, and I love the UK, and I love the English and the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh, but the weather is awful. And South Africa, we call it sunny South Africa for good reason. We have magnificent weather, and that is a real factor in our lives. We enjoy a good quality of life, very much an outdoor type of lifestyle. So it's a great country. It's very beautiful. It's got good weather. We've got excellent infrastructure, thanks to our forefathers, because it hasn't been particularly well maintained of late, but it is still good. And other than electrical shutdowns, because the powers that be now prefer to spend the income on bling and Bentleys and bonuses than on maintenance. So we have some failings in our electrical supply, and our dams have not been expanded, or new ones haven't been built of late. So the water supply is under some stress. So we have those factors, unfortunately, but we're still very much a functional country in terms of infrastructure. You mentioned, Karen, that you spent time in Southwest Africa, in Namibia.
Yes, I did. I was there for about 8 years.
Did you manage to come to South Africa at all during that time?
No, not then. But then when we left Southwest Africa, we came to South Africa, and I've traveled most of South Africa from 1968 until I left 4 years ago. So I know both countries very, very well. My dad was a great outdoors type of man, and we camped everywhere in the most unforeseeable places, not in the tourist traps as such, but all over the country in out-of-the-way places. My dad was also a private pilot, so we'd pile in the plane and go and land in the desert somewhere and spend some time there. So we really did travel the country flat. And as an expat, I have to say that South Africa is in your bones and in your blood. You will, as much as you might try to be integrated somewhere else, you will always, always have this big place in your heart for South Africa, because it is one of the most beautiful countries in the entire world.
Absolutely. I think anyone who's visited here would agree with you, and we certainly do, who live here. Although I have traveled extensively, I always do seem to come back. And as you say, it's in your blood, it's in your bones, it's home. And this is why it is so insulting to white South Africans who've been here for 360 years, which is, not too different from how long the white people have been in the United States. Yet now we're being told that we don't belong, and we're strangers here, and we're settlers here, and that we stole the land, which is absolute nonsense. How outraged would white Americans be if the farmers were told they have to give up their farms because they stole their farms from the indigenous population? History moves on. Centuries later, if you were a wandering herdsman 350 years ago, you can't come along now and say, you want that land because your great ancestors land which we've paid for, and it has passed through generation after generation. My wife's family, for instance, are Afrikaner, and they're 10th generation in this country. They can trace back their ancestry to the early settlers right through the trek of the 1800s, similar to the trek in America. The Americans went west, we went north and northeast. And if land changed hands, it changed hands for money. Title deeds are there to prove it, yet now we're getting a situation where people who've got no proof that their ancestors ever owned that land, they have no historical record, they had no written language, it's all word of mouth and quite honestly made up nonsense that they owned that land, and in fact the black tribes never owned land, the chief owned the land, and if he allocated you a piece of land, it was basically on loan. He could take it back at any time. There were no title deeds.
And it's still the way to this day, is it not? In the tribal lands, the chief still owns everything, and if you want to land, you have to apply to him.
Yes, to a large extent. I must point out that what a lot of people forget who criticize South Africa's past and perhaps even our present and our controversial policies of the past, every tribe, and there's groups, every tribe was given a substantial homeland. The Zulus had Zululand, they still have it. The Xhosa, who were the second biggest tribe, Mandela was a Xhosa, they have the Eastern Cape, or the Transkei as it's called. That is their land, and the chief rules his district, and the people can say they have a home, they have a homeland. The Swazis, as Swaziland is completely surrounded by South Africa, the Swazis have their own country. They're cousins of the Zulu. The Sutus have Lesotho. The Tswanas have Botswana and little homelands called Bafutha-Tswana. So every member of a black tribe can say he has a homeland, except for one tribe, and that's the white South African. We have never said we're taking this portion for ourselves and this is our homeland. We've never done that. Yet it's getting to a situation now where we might have to do that. And how we're going to do it is at this stage anybody's guess. But to be told that we don't we are part of this country and have been for 360 years, we now have to start identifying an area where we can become a majority. That's going to be Gauteng, one of the provinces which is the most populous, is 1.7 million whites there. There's about just under 1 million in the Cape. It would mean at least 2/3 of the white folk in the country moving to a particular province area to become a majority and actually have some say in their own lives. Because at the moment we are taxed to the hilt. Labour laws are stacked against us. This is supposed to be a non-racist new South Africa. That's what everybody voted for, including the white people. 2/3 of them voted for it. And new constitution, new non-racist constitution. We will all put the problems of the past in terms of race and get on with it. And that was what was South Africa. Not the ANC. Yes.
Cuan, you're breaking up rather badly. Would you like to log out and log in again, just so that people can hear you? Because the story that you are telling is vital to our listeners, and I don't want them to lose half of what you are saying.
All right, I'll try that. How are you getting me now?
That's better. But you've been breaking up rather badly.
All right, I'll just backtrack a little then if I could. I was saying that despite the fact that a new South Africa was sold, the dream of a new South Africa was sold to the voters 20-odd years ago, 94, in the first fully democratic election, people bought into this dream of a new South Africa with no discrimination, the past behind us, all the problems of race behind us, and no discrimination on the grounds of race or any other reason. But that hasn't been the case. Unfortunately, the new regime has instituted over 100 racist laws against the white folk, who are less than 10% of the population, to bar them from the job market and from the workplace. They're heavily discriminated against. It's a ridiculous situation where a minority, which should be protected by labour laws, if one is going to do that, the exact reverse is the case. The tiny white minority is discriminated against by over 100 labour laws. So the dream of the new South Africa has been stolen by the current regime, I'm sorry to say, and they have not made anybody freer. Free to loot, perhaps, for themselves, because it's now a kleptocracy where a manager of a little town, like the town I live in, there's only 8,000 people here, he earns, in our money, 2 million a year. I don't say earn, he gets paid, 2 million a year, which is something like probably $180,000 or $200,000 a year, which I know is a good salary even in the United States. And this is to run a little town. Because the regime allows this to build base, and who the only ones really who seem to pay personal tax are so heavily taxed almost to get ahead and to live. And then on top of that, they are discriminated against in the job market by over 100 labour laws, excluding them from the job market. We've got family businesses in South Africa, and I know this intimately because my own family have a family business, not me personally, but one of my relatives, and they're a family business, but the so-called equity laws have forced them to take on black employees. So a family business is no longer a family business. You're forced by law to take on complete strangers into your family business. And if you have a big company, you have to make complete strangers, who may not even be qualified, directors on the basis of the fact that they're black. Just a little aside, this particular family business which I'm talking about, we're forced to take on some black employees because of the equity laws. And in no time at all, they were robbed at gunpoint because one of the people they took on was tipping off the criminals on what's available. So you've got this situation where family businesses are under threat. Some of these businesses are centuries old. We bought into a dream that there would be no more discrimination, but there is a lot of discrimination, and it's all against the whites. Sorry to say. So we have our problems, and unfortunately, there's still racial problems.
That is entrenched in the Constitution, is it not? It says that there is no discrimination against race, creed, religion, whatever, except in the case of affirmative action.
Correct. The equity laws are totally in favor of the majority, which is a really crazy situation. So there is no protection for the white minority. The laws discriminate against them very heavily, and it's a crazy thing to say that that we have the most liberal constitution in the world, but that's only if you're black. So it's a weird situation. But all the same, we are not dismayed. White South Africans are resourceful and and hardworking and talented people, and we are surviving. But we also have against us a lot of crime, unfortunately, a lot of serious crime. And the most dangerous job in the world now is being a white South African farmer. They have more chance of being killed on their farm than a policeman has been of being killed on duty. And I'm sure you've seen some of the statistics, or perhaps on social media, some of the postings. Approximately 10% of our farmers have been brutally murdered in the last 20 years. That's about 4,000 of our farmers. The equivalent in America would be 40,000 of your farmers brutally murdered in the last 20 years. You would surely call that genocide. We certainly do. Yet the regime says, no, it's just ordinary crime. But the levels of brutality and cruelty and sadism associated with those crimes shows you that, in fact, it's terrorism. And it seems almost as though the regime is aiding and abetting it, because the president himself will dance on stage like a tribal and sing about killing whites. You just have to YouTube Zuma sings about killing whites, and you will see it. There he is singing about pass me my machine gun. We, the cabinet, not just anybody, we, the cabinet, will shoot the whites. They will run. And this is all in a Bantu language, but a lot of us can understand that, what is being said. So we have the outrageous situation where the president of the country is calling for genocide against a minority in his own country. This has got to stop. Appeals have been made to international courts. Nothing has really happened. The odd human rights hearing has declared that sort of song hate speech. The regime says it's a struggle song from the old days, but there was no black cabinet in the old days, so that they're talking nonsense. This is something that they're encouraging their people to do. And no sooner has one of these black leaders sung one of these songs, and there's an upsurge in farm killings, farm murders as we call it, the murder of farmers. So we really need the world to sit up and take note of what's going on here. It's an unacceptable situation. We will not stand for it. The commandos units, which were voluntary rural protection units, were disbanded under the last president, Mbeki, disarmed and disbanded, and no sooner had that happened than the statistics went through the roof of farm murders. So you have farm watch and so on, but they're not organized in a military fashion, which is what is needed. And as a result, also our borders have become very porous, because the commandos also used to keep an eye on the borders. So we have a little bit of a situation where law and order in the rural areas has fallen away, and our farmers are very, very much under threat. And there's an old saying here, if you kill a farmer, you kill a farm. Nobody wants to farm that farm if somebody's been brutally murdered there. So our numbers of farmers are shrinking, and obviously that puts our food security under threat. So a sensible government would see this, and they would do something about it. But they haven't done anything about it. And it's now getting to a situation where we actually have to appeal to international authorities to investigate this, do something about it. We've had Dr. Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch out here more than once, I believe, and he has put the level of genocide, as you would call it, I think at about level 6, which is very close to an actual genocide. So we're very close to a situation where our culture are shrinking due to these pressures, and I want to appeal to your listeners to actually do something, invest. Fortunately, we have social media now, and they can go onto a dozen websites which will show what's going on. Look up in farm murders South Africa. You'll be shocked at what you see. So, Karen, if you can in any way encourage your readers to do that, your listeners, I encourage my readers to. I have my own book page, and with a couple of thousand readers, and I'm constantly encouraging them to do their own research, so that it's not just propaganda from our side, they can actually see for themselves.
Yes, absolutely, Cuan, and that is why these types of shows are so very important, because we need many voices, not just my voice or your voice. We need many South African voices so that people can understand that it's not crazy right-wingers who are spreading these tales. It is actually an entire population, a whole tribe of white people who are suffering horrendous tortures and murders and discrimination. But if it's just one voice, people can dismiss it. If there are a lot of voices saying it, then people cannot find it that easy to dismiss what we are saying.
Absolutely, and as I mentioned, Karen, we do get along. The talk of white supremacy and right wingers and it's nonsense. It's anti-white propaganda, which I know you have in America as well. But it's nonsense. We get along pretty well. Speaking for myself, I've always got along with other races. I've lived in India. I've lived in Africa. I've always got along with people of other races. And in fact, at high school, my best friend was a colored boy. I don't have a problem with black folk at all. I get with them very well. I always have. My business in the past and to some extent now has been in tourism and tourism consulting and tourism development, which involves black people. We're in Africa. So I've always got along with them, and most South Africans do. It is the politicians who keep creating this animosity, and they need to be called to account. You cannot have a president standing on stage and dancing and singing about killing a minority group in his own country. You just can't have that in this world, this modern world. Yet they get away with it. It's got to stop. People have got to speak out against it. The problem is, which you have in the United States as well, is that your media is controlled by the very same people who control our media. And they seem to have, well, not seem to have, it's very clear, that they have an agenda to play down black on white crime and play up white on black crime, which is virtually non-existent there and here, as you well know. So yes, we have this problem. So thank God for social media. And as we say here, God save liberty from the liberals, because the liberal there and the liberal here, I think, are of one mind, and they seem to think that their culture or our culture is worthless and should be done away with, and that we must just become one big melting pot. Well, I can tell you now, a Zulu is proud to be a Zulu, and rightly so. And a Xhosa is proud to be a Xhosa, and rightly so. An Afrikaner is proud to be an Afrikaner, and rightly so. And they have every right to be, and we would encourage that. So it's not racial discrimination, it's racial integrity. And I believe that every culture has a right to exist. They have a right to their own way of doing things, their own lifestyle. That's good. It's a good thing. I don't go for the Marxist view that we must mush it all together and we must all come out the other end all the same. We're not all the same. We're very different. And those differences are important, and I believe that's what makes... Well, I was in tourism. How boring would tourism be if everybody was exactly the same and all built in the same style and all dressed the same and all ate the same food? And very boring.
So, why would you leave home to go and see home somewhere else?
Correct. So, quite right. We value our uniqueness. We value ethnicity, we value our language, we value our culture, and we value our history. And we encourage everyone else to do the same. So that's really important in a place like South Africa, where you have this disparity between what are called settlers, white, and indigenous black, which is actually a misnomer. The settlers in this country, black, white, all arrived more or less at the same time, and some by land, some by sea. Excuse me. So we all have a right to be here, and we need to get ourselves together now and build this country. It has got a magnificent infrastructure, as I say, but we need to build it in a sense of nationhood. The constant pulling in different directions is pulling the country apart, and I have to say, the regime has stolen the dream of the new South Africa. They're corrupt. They're incompetent, they're racist, and they really are not what we voted for. 2/3 of the white folk voted yes. They want a new constitution, a sharing of power, etc. There's been no sharing of power. There's been a grabbing of power and a raping of the economy. Tenders are given out worth billions by people who really don't know what they're doing to people who are supplying the wrong stuff. And money is squandered. We had a big scandal recently about some railway locomotives which were ordered. It turns out that the head of the railways, the chief engineer, isn't an engineer at all. He has fake qualifications, and these things are too high. They can't use them. Things like that. We spend billions on submarines and battleships, which we don't need, purely because there's huge kickbacks on the tenders. And I'm not saying that a country shouldn't have some kind of a defense force. Of course it should. But we're not facing any exterior threat. Yet billions are squandered on status symbols which stand and rust in the harbour. Instead of spending the money on useful stuff and like power stations. For 20 years there was no new development on power stations, electrical supply and electrical generating capacity. The income was spent, as I mentioned, on bling, bonuses and Bentleys. And then because the country is growing, it all caught up, and now some power stations, and we have what they call rolling blackouts, which is very irritating to everyone, and it restricts business. Shops suddenly have no power. Little workshops, welding and engineering works have suddenly got no power. They have to go and buy generators. It's creating a real situation here. This is on frivolous stuff instead of important stuff, and to criticize that, it's sensible. And the fact that the white technicians and engineers have been pushed out of these parastatals, pensioned off or made redundant, means a huge pool of skills has been lost by these parastatal companies, and it's to their great detriment. And it's such a shame. I believe that if it had been done differently, this country would be a very different place now. If the recognition was there that the whites have contributed hugely to the development of this country. There were no towns in this country. There were no roads. There were no dams. There was no infrastructure. The whites built it. Yes, black folk also built it because they were employed to build it. They weren't whipped as slaves to build it. They were employed. And so they are part of it too. But for them to say now that we stole the country and we don't belong here is expedient, and it's not true. And I do believe that a completely different approach from the current regime has to be taken. Otherwise, this country is going to become not a failed state. I don't believe we're anywhere near that yet, but certainly a shadow of what it could be.
Absolutely. Cuan, could we go back a bit now? Back to the history of how the Afrikaner became the Afrikaner, because they were not when they landed here. They were Dutch or French or Portuguese or whatever. How did the Afrikaner tribe get formed in South Africa?
Well, the original governor was, as you mentioned, Jan van Riebeeck, 1652, and his job was to set up this a station in the Cape to supply the ships, and his employees were of the French Huguenots arrived. They were invited here. They were religious refugees, and they brought with them wine-making skills. And South Africa has a booming viticulture industry. We produce amongst the best wines in the world thanks to this French influence. We even have a town called Franschhoek, French Corner. So they contributed greatly. At a later stage, we had German settlers and then British settlers around the 1820s. And of all these European nations, the Afrikaner tribe, as you've called them, and quite rightly so, they're virtually an African tribe now, with their own language, which developed from a mixture of a lot of these languages, but mostly Dutch and Flemish. They became aware of their own identity fairly early on. In fact, it's quite strange. When I first published my book, Bulala, which you've mentioned, I have an American editor, and he very often called the Afrikaner Dutchman. And I said to him, well, it might be strange to you, but to call an Afrikaner a Dutchman is actually an insult in South Africa. They don't take it too kindly. And he wanted to know why, because he thought, Dutch that he's met in America, and you have many Dutch settlers there originally, very good people. And I said, they certainly are. But there was a very clear difference from early on. The Dutch were those from Holland, or from the Java and their colonies there, and they tended to dress in the long wigs and the fancy lace and the buckled shoes and so on, whereas the folks born here were a much more rugged kind of people who were very much men of the land. And to call him a Dutchman would be almost to call him a dandy. So South Africans have a fairly rugged nature, and they wouldn't enjoy being called dandies. So it's an insult, actually, not because we don't like the Dutch, not at all. It's just that they were from the very beginning, the people born here started to identify themselves as Africans. And Afrikaner means man of Africa, and Afrikaans means an African language. So they're very much an African tribe, the white tribe of Africa. And after 360 years, they're as much part of this land as anybody, as a Zulu or a Xhosa or a Sotho or a Tswana, very much so. And they identify very much as Africans. They're not, you can call them of European origin or European descent, but they're not Europeans. They're Africans. They're South Africans. That's it. And the Afrikaner is a very much a Christian nation. They virtually all Christian, and they tend to be conservative, not in the narrow-minded sense at all. They enjoy things from many parts of the world, and very educated people in many. I mean, if the first heart transplant in the world was performed by an Afrikaner, Chris Barnard. The level of education was always excellent in this country. Unfortunately, it is slipping a lot now as the common denominator kicks in. But South Africans made great strides in agricultural engineering, in deep level mining, in nature conservation, higher education, in many fields, for front runners. And we are quite heart-sore in many ways, proud in some ways, but we're heart-sore when we see that very often great entrepreneurs and pioneers in the United States are actually South Africans. Every now and again something will come on social media, will say, are you aware that this chap who's developed this in the States and he's now a billionaire and he's making great strides, or he's running some massive corporate there, is ex-South African. Those are the quality of people that we've lost, although we still have great quality amongst our people. But there is very special people, the Afrikaner. And I do believe that anyone who's been to this country will agree with me when they say that we're a very welcoming and warm and open-hearted people, and very spontaneous people, and we speak our minds, yet still old school, still with the old way of manners and the old way of doing things in terms of conservatism. So I think your Bible Belt, as it's, we would be proud to be called that, but I think it's disparaging. Those kind of folk, we're similar, and the land is our most precious possession. The land is a very emotional issue in this country. And that is why we're having these problems now, is because our farmers are under threat. If I can give you an example, and it was one of the main motivations for me to publish my first book, and I'm busy with the second one now, but I, for about 30 years, was managing in nature conservation and tourism. And I decided when I get to 50, and I'm 58 now, or close to it, that I would buy either a game farm and breed game, a game ranch, or buy into a bigger enterprise, etc. So my wife and I set out about 8 years ago on a countrywide tour. We traveled 25,000 Ks, I think it's about 15,000 miles in your language, all over the country looking at land. And farmer after farmer would say to me, you know, my farm is for sale, but I have to tell you, it's under land claims. And I'd say, well, how can it be under land claims? You know, how long have you been here? And he'd say, well, I farmed here all my life. My father did, my grandfather did, my great-grandfather did. But suddenly we're under land claims, and the government pays the legal fees of the claimants, no matter how spurious the claim. Yet the poor farmer has to come up with his own legal defense and to defend against this claim. And more than one farmer said to me, I've got to warn you, many of my neighbors have been murdered. I want you to come and farm here, but you've got to be aware of the situation. And this went on, and province after province, we went to the best game ranching country, which is what used to be called the Eastern Transvaal, the Lowveld, and Mpumalanga it's called now, and Limpopo. Found out that 84% of the land was under land claims. 84%. Same in the northern province then, Limpopo. Most of the land was under land claims by tribes who wandered into the area grazing cattle at some stage, and now suddenly wanting to claim all the land, take it away from farmers with title deeds. So it dawned on me that it would be foolish to invest in a game ranch at this stage of our history until all this gets settled. So the ANC not only has stolen the dream of the new South Africa, they stole my dream too, because my dream was to game ranch. Now I would be foolish to do that. We now have South African game ranchers looking north, going to Zambia, and wanting to invest there because the land tenure is actually stronger. So it's a weird situation. Our farmers are being welcomed into Mozambique. They're being welcomed into Zambia, Angola, the Congo, you name it. Other black African countries are welcoming our white farmers there and saying, come and farm here. If you don't feel secure there or your government doesn't protect you, come and farm in our country. One farmer feeds 1,000 people. So we lose one farmer, that's 1,000 people whose food is not being produced. They are such a precious and irreplaceable resource that I cannot understand how this government can not step forward and do something about what's going on here. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're encouraging the land grabs and the pressure on the farmers. But that is the communist way. And I'm sorry to say, people who believe that communism is dead and gone when the Soviet Union collapsed, they're quite wrong. The ideology was ingrained in the liberation movements, as they called themselves here. They were Marxist-based. And that ideology is still there. And just like this, when the Russian Revolution happened in 1918, the first people to get targeted, and for the next few decades, were the landowners, the farmers. The state saw them as a threat. And the same thing is happening here. So it's an easy thing to say to your electorate, vote for us and we'll give you land. But to do that, they have to take it away from the farmers. And unfortunately, the black African, and we're just facing facts here, is not a commercial farmer, not in this country. They are subsistence farmers. The huge farms which supply the cities are virtually all Afrikaner farms. There are a lot of English-speaking farmers who are also commercial farmers, but the majority are Afrikaners, and they are under threat. And they call themselves Boers, of course, here. A Boer is merely the Dutch or Afrikaans word for farmer. So we had a situation, going back into history a little bit, when Britain took over the Cape from the Dutch, and they introduced British settlers in a certain area as a buffer zone, and they've done very well. But they always had this idea that the Afrikaner was, if he was independent, was somehow a threat to them. And that's one of the strong reasons why the Afrikaners, who were Boers by then, trekked out of the Cape and into the hinterland, which was largely unoccupied, thanks to the famous Shaka Zulu. Most people have heard of him, King Shaka. The Whites never clashed with him. He was a little bit before the trekkers got up to that area, but he basically wiped out the entire population of the hinterland in a huge genocide called the Difakani, the Great Crushing, where the Zulus basically wiped out all the opposing tribes or neighboring tribes or assimilated them, and they left the hinterland almost barren and desolate. And that is the land that the Afrikaner Boers, the Trek Boers, moved into. So they didn't steal the land from anybody. They occupied unoccupied land and started building towns and farms and infrastructure. So that was in the 1800s. That's a long time ago. And those farms have been well established now. There's lots of fallow land, but of course the government's not interested in that. They want to take over the established farms. It's much easier to walk in when everything's been set up. But the track record, unfortunately, shows that within 2 years, those farms that have been taken over, which were productive commercial farms, start to collapse. And there's been many scandals of late where government ministers have ended up owning these farms, or government highly placed, highly connected, politically connected to the regime, take over some of these farms, and in no time these farms collapse, and those black workers who were on those farms are out of a job. So the whole movement is counterproductive. It's foolish, and it's about time that this regime woke up to that fact. I think they are aware of it, but they're expedient, unfortunately.
Cuan, so speak about those big farms that have been redistributed and what has become of them, because I've seen pictures of that. And it's actually frightening, because now you're having to import maize from Mexico and chickens from China and the USA, because ours are going to China and then coming back here. So eventually they've traveled from the USA to China, back to the USA, and then to you. And that is because of this war on the farmers.
Absolutely right. South Africa was always a net exporting country in terms of agricultural produce up until a couple of years ago, just a few years ago. The tide has turned. We are now a net importing country in terms of food and agricultural produce, which is a great shame. It is a reflection of what is happening here. And it's about time that this government got their act together and made what we call farm murders a special category of crime, which has to be counteracted. It has to be stamped out. Otherwise, we are heading, sorry to say, for starvation. The folks who are living on those farms, the workers and the laborers, where do they go when that farm collapses? They can't all go into the cities. There's not enough work. It's going to cause real problems in this country. And if we can get that sorted out, I see hope for this country. We're a wonderful tourist destination, and I think we have amongst the best game lodges and safari lodges in the world. But they almost operate in a vacuum. The poaching is a factor. We've lost a huge number of our rhinos, particularly of late, and there's some talk that there's even implications of people high up in the government in that. So we have this situation where it's almost in spite of this government that we've kept this country going. We really do need responsible people. You know, Mandela, I am not personally an admirer of Mandela because I know his history. And in fact, in my book, Bulala, his charge makes very interesting reading. But I will say that he did try, to a large extent, to reconcile the population groups, the racial groups in the country. He was something of a statesman. We tried to be. But his successor, Mbeki, is the one who scrapped the rural commandos, which has unfortunately led to a huge upsurge in rural crime and a real threat to the lives of our farmers. The third one, Zuma, he's taking the country backwards. You know, I appreciate that he is a Zulu and he enjoys his tribal culture. That's all very good, and I'm pleased for him that he has that. But we need that too. If he is proud to be a Zulu and he's proud of his culture, the Afrikaner, the Boers, they're proud of their culture, and they need to be allowed to develop that and live their way. We can't carry on like this. There needs to be white people brought into government, and I'm not talking about communist white people. There are a few in government. I'm talking about sensible people who really have a love for this country, who don't buy into some ridiculous, outdated ideology which has failed everywhere they've tried it, but who are sensible folk who... We've got such talented people in this country. We've got economists and technicians and professors of medicine who really can make such a huge contribution, but they're not invited into government. We instead have incompetence with fake qualifications earning massive salaries. They get put in because they're black, or they are politically connected, or they the government owes them because they were part of the liberation struggle. All this ideology is ruining this country. We need to get on with it. You know, we're workmanlike people. We just want to get on with it. We want to live our lives. We want to keep our families safe, keep our towns clean and neat. You know, apartheid, which is like an albatross hanging around the necks of the whites, keeps being brought up in the same way that slavery, the whites in America are still being lashed for slavery, which ended 150 years ago. Apartheid was ended by the whites here, in the same way that slavery was ended by the whites in America. There was nobody else who was going to do it. They ended it. So give them some credit for that. And it was essentially a self-defense mechanism against what we've got now. We've got squatter camps surrounding towns, living off that town. They don't pay rates, municipal rates. They don't pay for electricity. They don't pay for water. They get welfare money, which the taxpayer has to come up with. And the towns are, the property values are then pushed down at the same time that the municipal taxes go up. It's a lose-lose situation for the folks living there, and yet this is the way the country's going. You know, there's got to be a time where people say enough is enough. We are sensible people. Let's run this place together. But the whites have been completely shoved aside and vilified all the time. We are not the problem. We are the solution. And at less than 10% of the population, we're not a threat to anybody. So it's against the regime. Well, it's not all bad news, and I hope I'm not, giving that impression that that's all gloom and doom. Not at all. This is a wonderful country. We have wonderful people.
What I have to say about having you on the show is that you're always more upbeat than anybody else that talks about South Africa today. You still have hope that things are going to be okay and things will change for the better. So maybe yours is a good story to have on, because most of us don't believe that.
Well, as I say, the media there is controlled by the same people who control the media here, and you know who I'm talking about. They have a clear agenda to vilify us, to demonize us, to make out that we, when I say we, the white folk, we are the problem. We're not the problem. We are the solution. In this country, wherever you get white folk here, you get law and order, you get decent suburbs, you get good services. We're trying to hold it together, but the reins have been whipped out of our hands, and we have incompetent and greedy and corrupt people now running the show, sorry to say. And we have very little say. The Western Cape, which is all that's left really of the original Cape, the rest has gone to seed. The Western Cape, which is controlled largely by the only viable opposition in the country, who are far too liberal and leftish for my liking personally, but they do run their towns a lot better than the ruling party, and so they really are, I believe, trying hard to keep a good level of civilization, and that's all we're asking. We don't want to become a third world country. We're not there yet. But we're heading there if things carry on the way they are. And for some people, that's good enough. They're happy to live in a third world country. But there's a lot of people who aren't. And I'm very glad to say there is a growing middle class amongst the black folk here. They aspire to the same things that middle class people all over the world do. They have children at schools. They've got school fees to pay. They've got mortgages to pay on their houses. They've got higher purchase to pay on their cars. They want a decent level of living, and they know that they've got to pay for it. So they have to have a steady job. They have to have law and order. They've got to have good infrastructure. They've got to have good corruption-free governance. So the people who aspire to that are the hope of this country. And I'm glad to say that there is a growing middle class, and it's what's going to hold this country together. But the backbone of this country has always been the Afrikaner. And I say that very honestly. I am an English-speaking South African, but I consider myself an African. So you can call me an Afrikaner if you like, although it's only my second language. But I'm very proud of the Afrikaner. they have been vilified for so many decades by the leftist media, but in actual fact they're wonderful people and they are the backbone of this country to this day. But unfortunately a back can only carry so much, and the weight is now very heavy. And the labor laws, as I mentioned, are so stacked against the white that it's amazing that they're still making a living. There's a lot of white people now who are living in squatter camps. Some say as much as 1 in 8. I don't know if that's accurate. That would be, 12%? That's the figures I was looking at this evening. It's possible, but I think that's closer to saying they are living below the breadline or below the poverty line rather than necessarily in squatter camps. But there are a lot in squatter camps, and a lot of them would have ended up there anyway, anywhere in the world probably, but more of them are there because of the fact that they are shut out from the job market by these over 100 anti-white labor laws. And many of them are skilled people, technicians, craftsmen, and it's virtually impossible to get a job in government these days if you're white, or any kind of job in government, in local administration. It's virtually impossible because you're white. So there's still apartheid, but it's the other way around, against a minority, which is the strangest thing, a less than 10% minority. So that's a real problem. And if the whites will welcome them to the job market, because they should be, they deserve to be. If the government gives out contracts, give them to competent people, not to your pals who have got no qualifications, no experience, but they are politically connected. And they get these huge government contracts. The money gets squandered. The roads don't get built, or they get built and they wash away in no time. The government's got to get, as we say, got to come right. They've got to get sensible. If they really love this country, as we do, and I've got to make that point strongly, we love this country and we don't want to see it go down the tubes. If this government, which fought for this country, they fought what they considered a liberation war, then surely they love the country. And incidentally, we were never defeated as a people, the Afrikaners, the white South Africans. They willingly handed over this country on a plate, complete infrastructure, all the reins of government were handed over in a peaceful election. It was a miracle in many ways. I don't think any nation anywhere on earth has handed over their entire country to somebody who fought them for 50 years. So they were not defeated. This was a rational decision made by the leaders at the time. And it's a slap in the face for the white people now to be told we don't belong here and that we're a problem, when this country was handed over with everything that it represented at the time. It was the most developed country in Africa. It still is. It had a magnificent infrastructure. It was a glittering prize that was handed over willingly, democratically, and to be told now that we don't belong here is an absolute insult and a slap in the face, and it's just plainly not true. So when this regime, and here I'm raging against the regime as the show entitles me to do.
Good, thank you.
Please, if any government functionaries are listening, then they need to hear me, and they need to hear our people. We want to contribute. We want to make a difference. We want to help this country grow. We want to help this country develop and prosper, all of its people. And when I say we, more than 2/3 of the white folk in this country voted to draw up a new constitution and a completely non-racist, non-discriminatory constitution. That has been pushed aside, and this government has instituted law after law after law. We not only have BEE, as they call it, Black Economic Empowerment, we have BBBEE, which is broad-based Black Economic Empowerment, which is, we're getting ridiculous now, sublime to the ridiculous. We have affirmative action. The time now is to say, right, it's been 21 years since that democratic election. There were people who weren't even born then who are now 21 years old. They're entering the job market. Why should they be discriminated against on the grounds of their race? It flies in the face of the entire effort that this country went through. And it's time for the enough. Let's now appoint people on merit. If you want to appoint somebody for a certain position in your company, do it on merit. You don't even have to know what color they are. Do it on merit. But this constant harping on race, this constant harping on the sins of the past or the apartheid or whatever, those are excuses for incompetence and non-achievers. It's time to take the bull by the horns and say, let's build this country together. Let's do what we know we can do. We have a wonderful opportunity here, and I don't want to see this government, this current regime, squander that opportunity through corruption, through incompetence, through racism. They need to put all that aside and create a clear vision for all South Africans. And we need statesmen for that. We need Mandela was a man of his time. As I say, I'm not personally a great admirer of the demigod that was created around him by the media. This godlike figure. He was a man, and he had his failings, but he also had a lot going for him. He was a man of his time, and he tried to be a statesman. We need people who want to be statesmen, that want to create a better country, not just grab as much as they can. Karen, I can go back to the history of the country if you like, or I can talk about the current situation. What would you like me to go on about here?
Cuan, whichever suits you better. I'm very happy with what you're saying. It's a wonderful introduction to the facts about South Africa. And the fact is that the blacks in South Africa are suffering just as much as the whites. There is black-on-black murder, wholesale. And there is black-on-black theft. And there's black-on-black discrimination. In fact, probably the highest unemployment rate in South Africa, as it is in the USA, is among young black people. And I don't see a future for them either, if we do not increase and help the education system there. But how do you help people who burn down the schools and the universities? I mean, it just becomes a snake biting its tail problem.
You're absolutely right. You know, unfortunately, one of the main slogans of the liberation movements, which fell under the banner of the ANC, or they were the most prominent, was we're going to make this country ungovernable. And then they've never got it right ever since. It's still ungovernable. And they created a culture of entitlement. They created a culture of corruption. That's got to change. And we need moral leaders who set a good example. You know, I'm sorry to say it, but the president of this country blew $25 million worth on upgrading his personal homestead. Now, when he retires from office or his term ends, that's his personal homestead. It's part of the heritage of the people. You know, if a government house was for the people, the gardens were for the people. This is a personal compound. It sets a very poor example when the man at the top, what they called security upgrades. Well, a chicken house is not a security upgrade. A swimming pool is not a security upgrade. Anyway, there's been many arguments about this in Parliament, but the opposition have had a good go at them. He laughed at them, and he laughed in the face of the taxpayer. Sorry. Set a good example, it'll trickle down. We've got massive corruption in government. Billions are squandered, as I mentioned. That's got to stop. The rule of law has to be enforced. If criminals are getting away with murder, literally, people, you know, it's hijacking is a common thing here at gunpoint. Armed robbery are common. And we need strong leaders, moral leaders who set good examples. Unfortunately, Africa has a history of very poor leadership, and that's got nothing to do with color. Let the man who's good at ruling rule. Let the man who's good at governing govern. do away with this constant reference to race, that we have to have blacks in power, and we've got to have whites pushed aside because of apartheid in the past. Do away with all of that and get on with running the country. The police need to have the teeth to stop the crime. The army used to patrol the borders. They don't anymore. I don't know what they do, but they don't patrol the borders. They seem to be in the Congo and various other places, but they're not on our borders. And our borders have become porous. We've got an influx, a huge influx of illegal immigrants. And they don't bring investment. They don't bring skills. They very often bring crime and more expense to the taxpayer, because housing has to be provided, more infrastructure has to be provided. We can't have the whole of Africa moving into South Africa. We cannot provide for the whole of Africa. So we have to tighten up our borders. You know, I'm speaking now as a normal tax-paying civilian. I don't have the resources to change any of this other than to talk about it. But there are men in government, powerful men, who can change it. And I'm appealing to them, to their better nature, to their patriotism, you know, that perhaps is a misnomer, but their pride in their country, to actually do something about it. So we need good people, and we do have good people, but they've been sidelined. It's almost as though we have the African syndrome of grab as much as you can, as while you can, before it's all gone. And the country's being looted by the people in power. That's got to change. And I'm appealing to any listener who happens to be in South Africa to speak out. And the time for walking on eggs is over. The time for apologizing for our country will become a third world country. But as I say, it's not all doom and gloom. We still have a magnificent country. We have a good infrastructure, but it must be maintained. So, Karen, I only say there is ground, and they're going to have to say enough is enough. We will not stand for incompetence. We will not stand for on merit. Infrastructure contracts must go to the most qualified companies who are experienced in it, not to particular connected pals, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, Stuart. And that goes for the sports teams as well, because we used to have the best sports teams in the world. Our cricketers won, our rugby players won. Everybody were worldwide winners. And then now we have to be affirmative there as well, so you don't get a place in the national sports team by merit, you get it by color. It can't work.
You know, a coach will choose the best players he can. It's as simple as that. And if they all happen to be black, well, good. If they all happen to be green, even better. Springboks. But to have quotas in everything, that your sports team has to have so many blacks and so many whites, it's a load of rubbish. There's some very, very good black sportsmen who are in the teams, and they deserve their places. Because they're black. It's an insult to the good black players. And we have some excellent ones. We have a cricket team. We recently had a youngster who took a hat trick of wickets. I think he's only cricket who's done that. We've got some really good black sportsmen, and it's an insult to action in sport, as it is an insult to anybody in any kind of business. We have some very good black professionals in business, and it's an insult to them when people look at them and think, and they need to speak out. Black professionals need to speak out and say, I'm here on merit. I'm here because I'm good at my job, or I'm the most qualified, or the most competent. Don't for a moment think I'm here because I'm black. And the same way that if there's a white director of a company, let's have the privilege of assuming he's there because he's the best. A quota system is an insult to everyone. It's racist. That's what we voted against. That's what the new constitution was supposed to ensure, that we wouldn't have this. But they did got a little clause open which said to level the playing fields, we can have affirmative action. Unfortunately, that playing field's been tilted completely in the other direction. Even the literal playing field got to stop. I want to know I'm supporting an South African team that's made up of the very best players available.
Yes, cream of the crop, not just to the lowest common denominator, because we de-incentivizing the need to be good to be the best. People, well, I'm very competitive, so you have a need in you to be the best. And are we de-incentivizing that because there is no prize for being the best? If you're the best in your school, you still may not get into university. And if you're the best in your sport, you may not get into the team. And so on and so on, because we all get a prize just for showing up. And I think that is such a shame, because then why even bother to try and be good at what you do?
Yeah, that's quite right. There are a lot of youngsters who, as I say, who are now entering the job market or going into university who weren't even born when Mandela was freed. So why are they paying the price if they happen to be white? If they are getting straight A's in their matric year, their final year at school, they should be a shoo-in for a bursary, for a good university, but they're being sidelined, and people with lower grades are being put in their place because they're black. What does that do eventually to the quality of our professionals? It lowers the quality. We are a country which has a very proud record of great achievement in virtually every field, whether it's, as I mentioned, economics, agriculture, mining, technology, you name it, medicine. We were very proud to say we were amongst the best in the world, very often the best in the world. Can't carry on if we keep putting in second-grade people. And it's got nothing to do with race. We had a youngster the other day who qualified as a doctor at 20 years old. He's a black chap. So he's either an absolute genius or he was shoved in through because he's black. I'd like to think it's the former, that he's an absolute genius and he's the youngest doctor who's ever qualified in the country, and he's absolutely wonderful if it was on merit. So let's not fool ourselves, and let's not make fools of ourselves. We have to appoint on merit. We have to put the best forward. Our best foot forward, our best people forward. So just to backtrack a little bit, if I might, on the history of the country, nowadays the history of this country is being twisted and distorted. The old history is being airbrushed out, and I'll give you an example. I was at a book show, and I saw a beautiful stand with all these boxed sets of heroes of the struggle, various box sets, and I went and had a closer look, and the heroes of the struggle were all, of course, Mandela and Mbeki and Tambo and all the so-called freedom fighters. And I asked the publisher, I said, what about the Boer generals who were heroes of the struggle against British imperialism? And he looked at me as I was nuts. History, that is what set the tone for this country for the next 100 years, up until now. The Boers fought 2 wars against Britain for their independence. The first one, it was more a series of battles than an actual war, and Britain had to take a step back. But then gold was discovered, and diamond had already been discovered, and these avaricious eyes were focused on the country. And at that stage, there were 2 Boer republics, the Free State and the Transvaal, the ZAR, as it was called, the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic. And Britain invaded, or let's say they set it up that it became Boer republics. It took 2.5 years. They thought it would be over in a couple of months. Well, they were taught a lesson in military tactics on the veldt by the Boer commandos, 2.5 years. And to actually subdue the Boers, they had to burn their farms. They burnt tens of thousands of Boer farms, chopped down the trees, poisoned the stumps, burned the fields and slaughtered or confiscated the livestock, cut off their food supplies, put their women and children in concentration camps. Up around about 30,000 Boer women and children, non-combatants, died in those camps. mostly children, in fact, over 20,000 children. There'd be 250,000 more Afrikaners today if those people had not died in those camps. So, all the Afrikaner or the Boer has ever really wanted, the white South African, is to rule themselves. Yet, time after time, that right has been taken away from them. And we're in that situation again, government, democratically elected government, and now we're being sidelined and vilified. So the time has come again to say we need to govern ourselves. We've never wanted to govern anybody else. So that situation again. And I was just reading a little bit today about the Serbs and their struggle for liberation. They were 700 years under the heel of Islam, and they had no sooner broken free than communism. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they decided, right, they're going to take their freedom. And it took a bloody war, and they were even bombed by NATO. But today there's Serbia. The Serbs have their homeland. Israel, 2,000 years wandering in the wilderness of the rest of the world. They had to take back their country or their land, and they took it. And they get criticized and they get vilified, and a lot of the way they did things, a lot of people don't agree with. Some of it I don't agree with. But there's Israel. So they have their homeland. Yes, they're under threat. They're virtually under siege, but they have their homeland. The Serbs have their homeland. Once again, they are facing annihilation, they're facing genocide, they're being sidelined, they're being vilified, they're being preyed upon, murdered in their own homes. It can't go on. So I'm saying to our people, we must not give up hope. There is always hope. Where there's life, there's hope. But it's going to take a mindset of oneness, that we become of one mind and decide, right, enough is enough. We will not be kicked around. We will not be sidelined. We will not be vilified. We will not be victimized. We are going to move to an area of this country where we form a majority. And that's not going to be easy. And people have to give up homes and businesses to do that. But if that is what it takes to survive, it's worth it. The alternative is too ghastly to contemplate.
Well, you're going to give up your home and business anyway, but by force. If you don't join hands and stand together, as you said, as one, then it's going to be taken away from you. So really, there is very little choice right now. If your eyes are open, and you can see the signs and you can see the laws that are being passed, then you have to realize that no matter what you do, they are going to take it away from you. And if it's not by a legal method, it's going to be by your murder. So you need to take a stand right now, as the Afrikaners have done throughout history, and say, look, genoeg, enough, people. We're not taking this anymore. This is where we are going to take a stand, because Afrikaner has always done that.
You're absolutely right, and as I mentioned before, and I have to say it again, the Afrikaners never wanted to rule anybody but themselves. It was by default that they ended up ruling all the black tribes, thanks to the British. The British crushed the two Boer republics, where the Boers, for only 50 years, had been their own rulers, and those were peaceful countries. They crushed them and took the gold mines and the diamond mines, etc., all the mineral wealth, and then made the country one. The Union of South Africa in 1910. 1948, the Afrikaner once again got the reins of power, but they ended up ruling the whole country. It was not by choice, it was by default. All they ever wanted was to rule themselves. So it will take a seismic shift in thinking to actually get back to a situation where they can say that they refuse to be ruled by people who hate them, who victimize them. They want to rule themselves. But it's going to take strong leaders to stand up and lead them to the new promised land. You know, there was a chap, you may have heard of him, he was considered a right-wing radical, a white supremacist, you name it. Mainly that was bluster. He was pretty much down-to-earth guy. Eugene Terblanche was his name. He was brutally murdered, incidentally, just a few years back on his farm. He became a statistic, brutally murdered, beaten to an absolute pulp, and smashed beyond recognition. But he said something once which I've never forgotten. It was at the time of the handover to the ANC. He said to them, push my people into a homeland. He was talking about the Afrikaner Boers. Push my people into a homeland. Institute apartheid against us. You don't have to build schools and roads and infrastructure for us like we did for you. Just leave us to it. You can push us into the desert. And within 10 years, I guarantee you, that will be the powerhouse of Africa. And I think he was absolutely right. Because that, or those civilized living, move to an area, and there is an identified area. It's the northern part of the Western Cape and into the Northern Cape, which is sparsely populated. If they could, I know that in 10 years, that would be the Monaco of Africa.
But then, sure, history will repeat itself.
Yes.
Will it not? The blacks will then want into that same area because they've trashed their own, and now they want into where the whites have made it once more to the powerhouse of Africa. So that is the history of South Africa, and that is what will happen in the future, will it not?
Seagulls following a fishing boat. It's always happened. Wherever the whites have built a town, black folk arrive to enjoy the benefits of civilization or look for work or medical care. That's the way it is. But, you know, they allow people in if they are bringing something to the table, that they're not just coming to squat. They're not just coming to build shacks there and live off the taxpayer and bringing crime and disease. They don't allow that. So the Afrikaner, the Boer, have always seen themselves as one of the tribes of Israel. That might surprise people, but they've always seen themselves that way. They, much like American pioneers trekked west, encountered hostile tribes, the Afrikaner Boer, and they encountered hostile tribes. They were wandering in the wilderness like the Israelites. The manual for everyday living was the Bible. They were very conservative, Bible-believing people to a large extent they still are. So they are a lost tribe of Israel. They're entitled to a homeland. They have more than any other group to this country, to the development of this country. So they have every right to be here and at least a space to call their own, where they can govern themselves, where the tax that they pay gets used. The statistics are not immediately at hand, but they generate twice as much in terms of tax as gets spent in the area. The rest goes into a big pot up in Pretoria and gets squandered on who knows what. So that's got to change, and we are getting to a situation where we have taxation without representation. It's pointless voting for a political party that represents you and your ideals when they are such a tiny voice that they just get shouted down. We need to have our own space, our own leaders, our own way of living, and I hate to say it, but it's going to take almost a catastrophic event to trigger that, and I believe it will come, unfortunately, that the situation will get so bad that people will not have any other option. But
well, Cuan, I see the trigger for that as the EFF and Malema. That for me, as somebody outside the country, I see that as what is going to be that trigger, and then a leader is going to have to stand up amongst the whites.
Well, you know, they say the man comes when the time is right. The moment creates the man, and we are hoping for that, of course, that a strong leader people, because we haven't been welcomed into the new South Africa. We've been pushed out of it. So we're kind of in limbo at the moment. It's a shame that we have had so many South Africans, white South Africans, leave. But some have come back when they've realized that, this is a good country. Tough as it might be in many ways, it's still home. But, it almost seems a pipe, but I'm sure Israel seemed to the folks who for 2,000 years had been wandering around without a homeland. And yet today they exist. So I believe there is hope, and we are a strong people and a resourceful people. And I'm not one to talk of armed insurrection or secession or anything like that. I'm a law-abiding and level-headed person. But there comes a time where these things are forced. Bad. That people will be pushed into an area where they will be majority, then that comes about almost by default. One of the conservative leaders of the past said the only time the Afrikaner stands up is when his face is shoved in the gravel. Well, things are getting pretty gritty, I can tell you. And it's time that people had the courage to actually speak out.
I see amongst the South Africans, and I see amongst the South Africans that there are many strong leaders. If they could put aside their trivial and small differences and join hands and do it together, there are leaders, there are strong people. The Boer has always been that way. But I think their downfall is that they've always been very independent-minded, and so my way is the only way, and so it's hard for these many very little groups to, as I say, put aside their minor, and there are minor differences that they are willing to fight about, and just join hands and do it.
You're absolutely right. The Afrikaners have a joke that if 4 of them ended up on a desert island, within a couple of weeks there'd be 3 different churches. Very independent-minded people, and our history has created that. It was a wild and untamed place, and people had to be very resourceful and self-reliant, and we still are. And it has to be a very strong and a moral leader to get the support of the people, because most men have feet of clay, and it soon shows. The man has not arisen yet. We have some good leaders, as you say, and some politicians who are good men, but they have not captured the imagination of people. They don't have perhaps the required charisma or the force of personality to actually carry this whole thing forward, this dream. There has been talk of the Western Cape seceding from South Africa because people are basically sick and tired of paying over money to the central government, etc. But it's all talk, and I think under our constitution it's probably illegal to withhold taxes, etc. But people are getting to the point now where they're fed up, and it might come to that. The only viable area, as I've mentioned, where we could perhaps form a majority, but then it would take virtually all our people to move there, would be in the northern part of the Western Cape and in the Northern Cape. And although it's a fairly arid area, that's never been a factor for our farmers. They can turn desert into gardens, and I'm sure they could do it again. But it'll take a complete change of mindset, as you say, this fractious nature of the Afrikaner or the Boer, to come together. But I think they're going to be forced together eventually. I think things will get so bad, unfortunately, that they will have no choice. And we're seeing it already to some extent. People are moving into gated villages. They're moving on to guarded estates. They're back into lagers, as we used to call them, circle the wagons. That's already started. That's been going for a while, and soon it's going to become entire areas, I believe. And it's unfortunate, we had a chance to build a new South Africa, but this regime, I believe, is still in that dream, and it's going to take a situation which I'm not looking forward to, that will bring this about by coercion rather than by choice. So, we hope and pray. We believe that we are a people who are strong enough to actually do this, but it's going to take a complete change of mindset. The fractious nature of our people counts against us. We have to come together. We have to be of one mind, and we have to decide it's now or never. As you quite rightly said, that choice is taken away when you lose your business or you lose your home or you lose your life. So rather take the choice while you still can.
Yes, freely. Make it a choice rather than a forced issue. We're at the 15-minute mark left, June. As I say, the floor has been yours today to go wherever you want to wander, and I think we've had a really, really good discussion. People have learned an incredible amount about South Africa that they didn't know before, because there is no news anywhere about South Africa. You can look throughout the world, and there's nothing about South Africa whatsoever, unless it's the Oscar Pistorius or Charlize Theron or one of those things, but nothing of value about South Africa. So,
I'm glad you mentioned. Sorry, Karen.
Yes.
You go ahead.
No, you're glad I mentioned?
Charlize Theron, or Theron as she calls herself now, Charlize Theron, we would call her here. But, I do believe, with a bit of luck she's listening, I do believe she had a wonderful opportunity. She is a great Hollywood star. She's known throughout the world. She's a beautiful woman. She has charisma. She has glamour. She has charm. She could have used all of that to really make a huge statement by adopting an orphan whose parents had been murdered on their farm in South Africa, and there's thousands of those. The estimate is 4,000 white farmers have been murdered on their farms. That's 10% of our farmers. That's equivalent of 40,000 being murdered in America in a 20-year period. There are many, many little orphans as a result of these farm murders. Now imagine if she had adopted one of these little Boer children, Afrikaner kid, and said this child is orphaned as a result of the creeping genocide that's taking place in South Africa. But she didn't do that, and she adopted a little black kid, and good luck to the little black kid. But she could have made a huge statement, and I think she missed a wonderful opportunity there. But there we go. It's a great shame that she has turned her back on her people, but there it is. Anyway, the bottom line is that we will survive. We have survived 360 years on a savage continent, and people must understand that Africa is not a civilized place. It never has been. I sincerely hope that one day it becomes so. But if it is going to, then we will have to play a part in that. And I unfortunately think that this current regime is lying to itself if it thinks that we're just going to go away. And we will not be crushed. We're a strong people, and we will stand up. It's going to be either we stand up and shake hands, or we stand up and shake fists. But I hope it's the former. We are Africans. We are white Africans. We're here to stay. We have as much claim to this land as anybody, and we have been very, very instrumental in building this country. And to shove us aside and vilify us is unacceptable to us, and it should be unacceptable to any right-thinking person anywhere in the world. So we do appeal to like-minded people to take note of our struggle and to give us the support that they should do. And all those, should we call them liberals, who supported the liberation struggle in South Africa, who held up their lighters at all the Mandela concerts, and who protested outside South African embassies, where are they today? I want to see them back there and protesting against what's happening to the minority South African Afrikaner Boers, the white people in this country. It's unjust, and it's got to change. So we're looking for their support too. And the media has a very clear agenda of ignoring our plight. So thank God for social media. The word is getting out. Shows like this, Facebook, Twitter, etc., it's getting out there. It's instant, and it's getting out there. So when you say that you don't hear much about I know exactly what you're saying. I was, as I mentioned, in the UK for a few months last year. South Africa's soccer captain being murdered, black fella, in a botched hijacking or a robbery. Very common occurrences. Yeah, it happens even to celebrities. So yes, it's generally bad news, but I want to say that it is still a wonderful tourist destination, and we want people to come here. We want them to see for themselves. And as I say, they tend to operate in a vacuum, the tourist attractions. You're pretty safe here as a tourist, generally. No more danger really than perhaps any third world country. Although as I say, also we don't want to be a third world country. We aspire to better than that. So I want people to see for themselves and to speak out about their experiences here, to publicize this country. We were front page news for all the wrong reasons for decades. Now we hardly make the papers, but we should be. We should be front page news again, and I appeal to people who have the access to media to use it to publicize what's going on here. It's not all bad, but a lot of it is, and let's get the word out there.
June, we have about 9 minutes left. So would you tell us about your new book and where people can get your book and where they can follow you?
The one that's out there at the moment is called Bulala, Bulala, and it is the byline is A True Story of South Africa. It's a novel history, so what I've done is I've stuck to the actual history of the country, and I've woven a story, a very readable, enjoyable, easy to read story about the country and about the people of the country. It's full of adventure. It's full of descriptions of the natural wildlife, the beauty of the country. It's a very easy read, and yet at the end of it you will have a pretty good idea of South African history without trying. That's available on Amazon, and in fact the first edition was published in the United States. It's available there. The publisher there is Sacred Truth. Easy enough to remember, Sacred Truth. Just Google it, and you'll get the email address. You can order it directly from them or from Amazon. Interestingly enough, the price in the United States is $18.38, which is exactly the same as the date of the miraculous Battle of Blood River, which, as a military historian, I can tell you there has been no battle like that ever in history of the world, where the title of the book, Bulala, is a Zulu word, means destroy or kill, and that's what the Zulu king, Dingaan, said to his bodyguards when he had just signed a land treaty with some Boer emissaries. He said, Bulala abatsagati, kill the wizards. And these Boers were slaughtered by the Zulus, and that led to the Battle of Blood River, where 500-odd Boers prayed fervently for 7 days that God would deliver their enemy into their hand. And they trekked into the middle of Zululand, and they were attacked by estimates of up 20,000. This is 500 men in a wagon laager, attacked by up to 20,000 Zulus, between 12 and 20,000, nobody's too sure, but vastly outnumbered. And they absolutely, completely and utterly defeated the Zulus. And the most remarkable thing, the miraculous thing about it, is they Boers never lost a single man. Not one. There's been no battle like that in history. So the price of the book, strangely, in the United States is exactly the same date, 1838. That book is available now. The second book, which is tentatively called Seven Stones, is nearing completion, the sequel, and I hope to have it out by the end of this year. But in the interim, the Bulala covers South African history from the very first explorers in the 1400s right up until Mandela, you could say. And the sequel will pick it up from there. But it's a good, easy read. It's a rollicking ride through our history. I think it's an enjoyable book to read. The reviews have been fantastic from all over the world, and I'm very pleased I did it. And as I mentioned, my journey through South Africa with my wife 8 years ago is what inspired me to write that book, because I wanted to tell the story of South Africa, what is going on in the country right now, how our farmers are being attacked, how their land has been taken away. And I realized that people might just say, oh, well, they're just getting what they deserved, because of apartheid, because we've had such bad publicity for so many decades. But we were in a new South Africa, so I decided, let me rather tell the story of how this country was established by our forefathers, how it was built. They came here, there was nothing here. They found essentially a barren wilderness, and they built it into a first world powerhouse. And that has now been taken away, and it's now degenerating into a third world country. So that story needed to be told, and that's in Bulala. You need to read it. It will give you a very good insight into how this country finds itself in the state that it's in now. And it'll give you the history of the Afrikaner, the Boers, the English-speaking South Africans, the Bantu tribes, the Khoi people, as I mentioned them. They were actually the only indigenous people here. If anybody has got a claim to this land stronger than anyone else, it would be them. Although they had built nothing and they had developed nothing, they were just living off the land. But there is a special place for them in all our hearts. They were the originals. And the other people of this country, we have Indians too. Yeah, we have a couple of million Indian folk who've been here about 150 years or so. They have a special place in this country. We have Chinese people here. We have Portuguese, Greek people. We have descendants who still identify with Europe. We have those who are completely identified with Africa. It's very much a melting pot in a sense, but yet everyone has managed to maintain their own cultural identity. So it's quite a unique country, and it should stay that way. We all have reason to be proud of our histories. Every one of us as a people have made mistakes, made poor decisions, but we've also done wonderful things, and those are the ones that we need to really remember and build on. So I encourage your listeners to get a hold of it and read it.
I personally would highly recommend that book. I'm reading it for the second time because the first time I read it through very fast in order to be able to interview you once, and I'm reading it for the second time but more slowly. And even I, who learned the history of South Africa in my school days, have never had such fun reading a book because it's real. It's people that you can identify with. And it is an easy read, but you will come out educated. So I would highly recommend it to anyone in learning about South Africa. It's a fabulous read. It really is, and I'm really looking forward to your new book. And if you would just give your websites, because we have 3 minutes left, we're about to close.
Okay, Karen, thank you very much. The best bet is actually Facebook. I find that is a very good medium to communicate. There's a Facebook page called Bulala, B-U-L-A-L-A. Bulala by Cuan Elgin, C-U-A-N-E-L-G-I-N. Bulala, easy enough to remember. And it's got a couple of thousand readers on it already. That's the best way for us to communicate. It's the best way for me to keep readers up to date on the sequel, the progress of the sequel. And I'll also publish excerpts from the first book, Bulala, on there, and also day-to-day updates on the situation in South Africa. So if you're on Facebook, go to Bulala, B-U-L-A-L-A. Let's stay in touch. And I look forward to keeping you up to date. And I want to thank you, Karen, for this opportunity to tell your listeners about our country. We're very proud of it. We love it, and we want it to succeed against all odds. We pray to God that we will manage. Thank you for having me on your show. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Cuan. You're always a wonderful, wonderful guest. And once again, I would like to thank Rage Against the Regime, Becky Williams, and Bobby Ritter for giving us this new platform. I hope we do you proud, and I hope you like our efforts. God bless South Africa, God bless the USA, and God help this world that we live in today. And I'm playing out with my personal act of defiance, destem.